What if the most dangerous secret in a fairy tale marriage wasn't betrayal, but intention? Sit with that for a second. Not an affair, not a scandal, not even a fight behind closed doors, but a plan. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. A quiet, unspoken understanding that something was never meant to last. Now ask yourself this. Why would a father, already painted as the villain in his daughter's story, risk being mocked, dismissed, and dragged all over again, unless he believed there was something the world fundamentally misunderstood? That's the question hanging in the air as Thomas Markle's words echo louder than ever. She told me she'd leave Harry one day. If that sentence doesn't stop you cold, it should. Because it doesn't sound like rage. It doesn't sound like revenge. It sounds like memory. And memories, especially the ones that refuse to go away, have a way of resurfacing at the most uncomfortable moments. Tonight, this isn't about proving anyone right or wrong. This isn't about crowning heroes or villains. This is about timelines that don't quite line up. About silences that grew too loud. About a story that may have been sold as destiny when it might have been strategy. And most of all, it's about a father who was never supposed to speak again. Let's start at the beginning. Not the royal beginning. Not the wedding. Not the headlines. The human beginning. Before the cameras. Before the crowns. Before the world decided who Thomas Markle was allowed to be. Once upon a time, he wasn't a punchline. He wasn't a tabloid caricature. He wasn't the problem parent. He was just a dad. A man who worked long hours behind the scenes in television. A man who, by his own account, poured time, money, and pride into his daughter's ambitions. A man who believed, like many parents do, that sacrifice was the price of giving your child a better life. For years, that belief sustained him. But something happened when Meghan's life crossed a certain invisible line. A line where privacy gave way to branding. Where family became complicated. Here's where things get uncomfortable. Because Thomas Markle didn't disappear after the wedding. He didn't vanish into obscurity by accident. He was removed from the story. Cut out. Rewritten. And if you believe his version, it wasn't because he didn't love his daughter. It was because he knew too much. Now, before anyone rushes to judgment, let's slow this down. Let's do what headlines rarely do. Let's ask questions instead of shouting conclusions. What kind of father watches his daughter marry into one of the most powerful institutions in the world and never meets the groom? What kind of family story leaves one side completely erased? And why, years later, does that same father claim his daughter once spoke about her marriage as if it had an expiration date? Think about that. Not if things don't work out. Not people change. But one day, definite, calm, casual. Thomas Markle has never described the comment as dramatic. That's what makes it unsettling. He didn't say she cried. He didn't say she ranted. He didn't say she begged. He has implied it was said the way people talk about plans they've already made peace with. And that raises a disturbing possibility. What if the world has been watching the middle of a story, while the ending was already written in someone's mind? Now, let's be clear. This video does not claim that statement is fact. It doesn't claim intent. It doesn't claim deception. What it does is examine why that statement exists at all, and why it refuses to fade away. Because words like that don't appear in a vacuum. They belong to a larger pattern. And patterns are where things start to get interesting. Ask yourself this. How many times have we watched Meghan Markle step into a new chapter, only to leave the previous one behind completely? Career shifts. Public rebranding. Reinvention after reinvention. Now, reinvention isn't a crime. In fact, it's often celebrated. We praise people for growth, for evolution, for refusing to stay boxed in. But there's a fine line between growth and detachment, between moving forward and burning bridges. Thomas Markle's pain, whether you sympathize with him or not, comes from one central belief, that he didn't just lose contact with his daughter, he lost relevance. And when someone loses relevance, their voice becomes inconvenient. And inconvenient voices are often silenced first. That's why this story matters now. Because public opinion is shifting, not against Meghan specifically, not in favor of Thomas automatically, but toward skepticism of perfectly packaged narratives. People are asking harder questions. Why do some stories have room for complexity, while others demand absolute loyalty? Why is reconciliation always expected from one side, and never the other? And why, after years of silence, Does this particular quote keep resurfacing? She told me she'd leave Harry one day. Here's another question worth asking. Why didn't Thomas Markle say this immediately? Why wait? Why let years pass before allowing that sentence to see the light of day? The cynical answer is attention, but the emotional answer is something else entirely. Fear. Fear of not being believed. Fear of being painted as bitter. Fear of confirming exactly what the world already thought of him. And yet, despite all of that, he spoke. That alone doesn't make him right, but it does make him worth listening to. Because when someone has nothing left to gain, no access, no relationship, no redemption arc, their motivation becomes harder to dismiss. And this is where the story stops being about gossip and starts being about consequences. Because if that statement was ever real, if it was ever said, even casually, then it changes how we interpret everything that followed. The royal exit, the interviews, the distance, the narrative of escape. Suddenly, it's not just a love story under pressure. It's a collision of timelines. One person running toward freedom, another believing in permanence, and somewhere in the middle, a father watching from the outside, holding on to a sentence he never thought would matter. Until it did. Now pause and ask yourself this. If you were Thomas Markle, and you believed your child once confided something like that, something that now seems eerily relevant, would you stay silent forever? Or would there come a moment when the weight of not speaking became heavier than the backlash of telling your truth? That's the tension at the heart of this story. Not proof versus lies, but silence versus speech. Because once words like these enter the public conversation, they don't just accuse. They invite reinterpretation. They force us to look backward and forward at the same time. And that's exactly what we're going to do. In this series, we'll trace the timeline carefully. We'll look at patterns without declaring verdicts. We'll ask why certain relationships faded while others were amplified. We'll examine how power, love, ambition, and identity can coexist and collide. And we'll return again and again to one uncomfortable idea, that sometimes the most honest truths aren't shouted in interviews. They're whispered years earlier, before anyone realizes they'll matter. Because if Thomas Markle is wrong, then this story is about a broken family and misunderstood intentions. But if he's even partially right, then the fairy tale wasn't shattered. It was scheduled. And that brings us to the question that changes everything. If a marriage is entered with different end goals, does love stand a chance at all? Because what comes next isn't about Thomas Markle anymore. It's about the comment he says he never forgot, and the moment he realized the world might finally be ready to hear it. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What kind of father gets erased from his daughter's biggest day on earth? Not quietly sidelined, not gently excused, but publicly absent. That's the question that refuses to go away. Because when Meghan Markle walked down the aisle into global history, the world noticed who wasn't there just as much as who was. Heads of state, celebrities, royalty, cameras everywhere, and one empty space that felt louder than all of it. Her father. Now here's the uncomfortable truth most people don't like sitting with. Weddings don't erase parents by accident. Something has to break. Something has to snap so cleanly that reconciliation feels impossible. So how did Thomas Markle go from proud, involved parent to the man everyone was told to forget? And more importantly, who decided he was no longer allowed to speak? Let's rewind. Not to the scandal, not to the tabloids, but to the version of Thomas Markle that existed long before the world had an opinion about him. He wasn't famous. He wasn't powerful, but he wasn't irrelevant either. By all accounts, Thomas Markle worked behind the scenes in television for decades. He wasn't chasing fame. He was helping create it. And if you listened to him, he believed that work gave him something far more valuable than status. It gave him a purpose. He paid for private schooling, supported acting dreams, encouraged ambition, the kind of quiet parental backing that doesn't make headlines until it's gone. And here's where things get interesting. Thomas Markle didn't fade out gradually. There wasn't a slow drifting apart, no gentle cooling of the relationship. According to his version of events, the cutoff was abrupt, sudden, absolute. One moment he was involved. The next, he was outside the circle. No access, no updates, no voice. Ask yourself this. How does a father lose contact with his child without a single clear explanation? That silence is the first crack in the story. Because when families fall apart naturally, there's usually noise. Arguments. Messy conversations. Attempts at repair. But this was different. This was containment. Thomas Markle didn't just lose his relationship. He lost the right to tell his side without consequences. Every word he spoke afterward was framed as desperation, manipulation, or betrayal. And yet, he kept talking. Why? Because silence didn't protect him. It erased him. Now pause here. This is where many people choose sides too quickly. Some say Thomas embarrassed Meghan, that he crossed boundaries, that he invited the media into private matters. Others say he was abandoned, confused, and pushed into a corner where the only way to be heard was to speak publicly. Which version is true? Maybe both. But here's the contradiction no one addresses. If Thomas Markle was truly irrelevant, why did his voice need to be discredited so aggressively? Why not ignore him? The answer might be simpler than we think. Because he knew the before. He knew Meghan before the polish, before the PR, before the carefully curated distance. And people who know the before can disrupt the after. Let's talk about that wedding absence again. We were told it was about trust, about privacy, about boundaries. But weddings are symbolic. They're about lineage, about where you come from, about who stands behind you when you step forward. Removing a parent isn't just personal. It's narrative. It says, this part of my life no longer fits the story I'm telling. And Thomas Markle became a loose end. One that needed tying up or cutting off. Now imagine being him. You wake up one morning and realize you're not just estranged, you're obsolete. The daughter you raised is now part of an institution that doesn't tolerate unpredictability. And you, by nature, are unpredictable. You speak emotionally. You speak imperfectly. You don't sound rehearsed. And in a world where every word is measured, that's dangerous. So what happens next? You're frozen out. And when you try to explain yourself, the explanation becomes the problem. That's how Thomas Markle turned into the embarrassing father. But here's the detail that complicates everything. Despite all of this, he doesn't speak like a man seeking revenge. He speaks like a man trying to be understood. Listen carefully to how he talks about Meghan. Even in criticism, there's a strange softness. Regret. Confusion. The tone of someone who still doesn't fully understand how things went so wrong. And that's where the alleged comment enters the picture. She told me she'd leave Harry one day. Think about why that sentence matters so much. It's not explosive on its own. It doesn't accuse anyone of wrongdoing. It doesn't reveal secrets or betray confidence. But it reframes everything. Because if that comment was said, at any point, it suggests forethought, distance, a mindset that treats marriage not as an end, but as a chapter. And suddenly, Thomas Markle isn't just a bitter father. He's a witness to a mindset, to a moment, to a truth that may not fit the official version. Now ask yourself, why would that memory stick with him? People forget casual comments all the time. They forget jokes, passing thoughts, offhand remarks. But some sentences lodge themselves in your mind like splinters, usually because they don't match the story you're being told. And Thomas Markle says this one never left him. Why? Because he believed in permanence. Because he believed in families sticking together even when it's messy. And because, deep down, that sentence felt wrong. Now, here's where things get uncomfortable again. If Meghan truly said something like that, even casually, does it mean she planned to leave? Not necessarily. People say things without fully understanding them. They speculate. They protect themselves emotionally. They hedge their bets. But it does suggest something else. Distance. A psychological exit already open. And Thomas Markle, whether he understood it at the time or not, became the keeper of that moment. A moment that would later feel prophetic. Which brings us to the silence that followed. After the wedding, after the spectacle, after the world moved on, Thomas Markle didn't suddenly regain access. There was no reunion, no quiet reconciliation away from the cameras. The door stayed closed. And here's the question no one asks loudly enough. If the separation was about protecting Meghan, why did it never soften? Why did time not heal? Why did every attempt at connection feel one-sided? Because usually, distance cools anger. It allows perspective. It creates space for understanding. But in this case, distance hardened everything. And that suggests something deeper than a simple family rift. It suggests incompatibility between a private person and a public project, between emotional messiness and image control, between a father who speaks from the heart in a world that prefers scripted vulnerability. And so Thomas Markle became the cautionary tale. The example. The person you point to when you want to say, "This is what happens when you don't play along." Which leads us back to that sentence again. She told me she'd leave Harry one day.